The subject of my talk today is actually a little bit different because the Jews that we're talking about don't live in the city, but they actually live in the countryside. This is a little bit misleading because actually I will show you on the map in a moment. Some of these little settlements, they're called settlements for lack of local population, but technically pre-imperial cities. But what we have going on here is the Jews basically are expelled from the various cities, pre-imperial cities of Alsace, beginning in the 14th century, continuing through the 15th and even the 16th century. And here it depends on what city, what year the Jews are expelled. For example, you have Strasbourg and expulsion in 1349 for Black Death, and then again in 1391, the Jews don't come back. Whereas in some of the other cities, Hallmark had this expulsion as late as 1510 or 1477. So you have a real change. It depends on which city, which village, but generally the Jews are moving from the cities out into the countryside, into the villages, with two exceptions, the cities of Hagenau and of Rosheim, here. These are pre-imperial cities. They have extremely small Jewish population. In Hagenau, the population is limited to 6 Jewish families, and in Rosheim, the population is limited to 8 Jewish families. And creating question in the 16th through the mid-17th century, just to give you a framework. But generally, we're talking about the Jews living in the countryside, and my question would be how they come into the city, why they come into the city, and what are the relationships that they negotiate for themselves with the city. And I just want to put this map before I go back to the text and show you where Jews live. And I took this map actually from a wonderful book by Gordon on Alsace. And these are the settlements. All the things you see now in my handwriting are any villages in which Jews lived in the 14th and 15th and the beginning of the 16th century. And what I've done is circled and added the villages in which Jews lived in the 16th and 17th century, with the exception of Strassburg, where the Jews didn't live, but was on the map because of the city focus. And I just wanted everyone to sort of have a visual of where these villages that we're talking about live. And this is Lower Alsace. Most of the Jews live in Lower Alsace, and some of them live in Upper Alsace over here. There's a couple of villages missing these, so that's not 100% comprehensive, so I just can't find the villages that small. Not common. But most of those villages are again in Upper Alsace and not in Lower Alsace. So the document we have is from Lower Alsace and also signed later that it's in Upper Alsace and Jews. Also, and signed also document. So we have a confusion. This is just basically the geographic context of what you have, of the Jews being spread out throughout the countryside. And in terms of economics, what they have to do is come into the city for work. And part of this is economic, and part of this is because of demographic realities. Just to give you a little bit of background, because I think this is just a little bit of a different topic than what we've been dealing with today. The Jews living in these villages and these towns in the countryside are living with very, very small Jewish populations. So in a town of, let's say, 2,000 to maximum 5,000 people, you have the largest Jewish community in Wingersheim, which is in Lower Alsace, with 11 Jewish families. And we know this from the kinds of lists that Holly had shown before, just lists of Jews, sometimes lists of a Jew and everyone in his household. So you have, let's say, Shmuel the Jew, his wife, his 2 kids, and a servant and a friend. And sometimes you'll just have a list of the different heads of households. But we can basically figure that these are very small communities, some with 1 Jewish family, 2 Jewish families. That's really the norm. And in the larger cases, 7 families or 11 families. So we're talking about extremely small settlements of Jews. So I think it sort of explains why it is that the city is such an important economic draw if you're going to make any money. And if you think about what these Jews did, which is primarily money lending, although there's some other things that the Jews are doing as well. Selling wine, selling horses, selling food, sometimes selling other animals. But this is the kind of thing that they're doing. They don't have the market in the small town or village in which to sell their goods or in which to lend their money. And certainly because they use these networks between various settlements, so that the Jews of one settlement and the Jews of another settlement and a third settlement, who are probably also related and married to one another, are pooling their resources to trade in the marketplace. They're going to be doing this in the larger marketplace of the city, and primarily
the city of Strasburg. And just in general, if you look at the Alsatian economy, it's very much centered in this way that Christians from these towns and villages, and even from the small cities like Hagenau or Rosheim, are coming into Strasbourg to do marketing, because that's the city that's on the trade axis, both north and south, and also east and west. So it's a logical place to come in. The problem that you have here, and sort of what makes this complicated and interesting, because the truth is that rural Jews, which are the norm for the Jews of Germany during this time period, they always come into the city. This is not unique to Alsace in any way. What's interesting here is that, and this is a text I translated, but I didn't want to actually read together, which is the second text from the municipal archives in 1530. It's the archive number 174-2082. This is a law forbidding the Jews of any part of Alsace, and probably Jews throughout the empire, from coming into the city. And just to lay the groundwork, this is not the reality. Much of what we've talked about today, we've seen the difference between prescriptive and descriptive sources. In this work, I wouldn't say that prescriptive sources have no impact whatsoever, because of course they do in terms of attitudes, and as we'll see, they have some impact. They don't really dictate reality. The Jews are coming into the city, but the laws starting in 1530 and then continuing, promulgating again, 1539, 1548, 1570, and on and on and on and on, are similar versions prohibiting the Jews from entering the city to different degrees. Sometimes it says no Jews can come to the city whatsoever for any purpose, except when we need to buy their horses, and then they can come. But usually the laws dictate that the Jews don't come into the city. So that's sort of the setup, but it's actually not what happens at all, which is what I wanted to focus on. And from the Jewish perspective, it's clear that the Jews need to enter the city for economic purposes. The document that I really wanted to focus on is the first document that I had translated, which is the Archive 174-21. And this is, for me, an extremely significant document about the agency that the Jews of rural Alsace take in terms of negotiating and acting upon their need to get into the city of Strasbourg for these economic trades. And basically, this is the first draft of a contract that the Jews make with the magistrates of the city. And just that sentence is sort of paradoxical. The magistrates of the city are the same people who promulgate the laws saying Jews can't enter the city, and yet they make this contract with the Jewish community of Alsace, first the Jews of Lower Alsace, which is what I've translated here, 2 years later with some of the Jews of Upper Alsace, and then again, I guess that was 1536, and then 1543, again with another group of Jews in Upper Alsace. And this is a contract which the terms of which are negotiated because of realities and not because of laws or stereotypes. And I think, one of the things, I'd really like to open this up as soon as possible, especially with just 45 minutes, but one of the things that I think we see here, aside from agency, is the role that the urban space, which is not Jewish space at all, played for the Jewish community, which is, one, an economic marketplace, and two, also a place of physical security, which are the last two texts that I've printed out here. But I think those will come out from the contract. But I'd like to just give a little bit of background on the contract and maybe look at some passages that I thought were extremely interesting. Maybe we'll start by reading the second paragraph just to give a little bit of the background. As has often happened, several Jews of this province have taken one of the commendable city of Strasbourg's burghers and subjects to foreign courts, and they, for years, requested a proper court. And this is a letter, which is a draft of the contract, from the leader of the Jewish community. And here I say Jewish community because all of the Jews in these different settlements considered themselves to be one Jewish community, sometimes two, one in Lower and one in Upper Alsace. Here we're speaking Josel of Rosheim, the leader of Lower Alsace, although he's involved also in the contract with the Upper Alsatian Jews. And he's writing to the city's magistrates explaining what had happened, which is basically that the Jews were taking the city of Strasburg's burghers to a foreign court. And by foreign court, what's meant is the imperial court at Rottweil. The Jews, as imperial serfs, had the right to go to imperial court. The fees for imperial court were extremely high and oppressive, and Strasbourg as a city had the privilege of not allowing the Jews to go to the imperial court, and they were just always fuming when the Jews would bring their citizens to foreign courts. This is a recurring pattern. And now, therefore, the strong, cautious, respectable, and wise men, the mayor and council of the city of Strasbourg, sent out a public mandate to their burghers that they should be released from us, meaning that all of the money that they owe us should be, the debts should be forgiven. And in the words of this mandate, their burghers are to be forbidden from borrowing money or any commercial activity with the Jews, and we should stay in the land. In other words, we are not permitted in the city. And the text that he refers to, and we know this from another draft of this document, is the law, the second text that I've translated here. What's interesting about this, and here's another place where you see the hole between prescriptive and descriptive, is that the law is promulgating in 1530. And this is a letter, this is a contract from 1534. So it's not as if Josel of Rosheim is reacting to this law that was promulgated, the day before, the week before. That's not the impetus for this contract, because there's been a 4-year gap in which presumably the Jews had to be doing something or suffering the consequences in some way. And he continues saying, once again, the same has occurred with Shmuel the Jew of Eschbach and with Blumel the Jewish of Pfaffenhofen, who took a burgher from the aforementioned city of Strasburg to court in Rottweil to collect with high costs, and therefore now the aforementioned honorable men from Strasbourg are taken in grasp with a displeasure and anger towards us, the Jewish community. And this is actually the impetus for the contract. These cases, we have other archival documents about these cases. These are cases where Blumel and Shmuel and one other Jew who's not mentioned in this draft, but who's mentioned in another draft, Jacob of Niedershofen, all lend money to burghers of Strasbourg. They are not paid back, and so they take the burghers of Strasbourg to court at Rottweil, and all of those cases happen in 1534. So first of all, it's clear that despite the law in 1530, all these transactions keep going on. And the impetus for this contract, or for Josel's communication, is that now the Strasbourg magistrates are upset. And it's their displeasure that I think is really bothering him here, rather than the laws that they're promulgating, which don't seem to have that much of an impact on their lives. And he's very clear about the fact that they're displeased and what the problem will be. He says in the next paragraph, just to read out one sentence, the Jewish community is at all times well inclined and of the will to do less than nothing against the commendable city of Strasbourg. In other words, we don't ever want to upset the magistrates. And in the second draft of this contract, he fills in the blank by basically saying, this is the place where we go when there are troops running through the countryside and we need physical safety, which are text 3 specifically is Josel's letter requesting physical safety. When we need a place for refuge, we turn to the city. And so the city for the Jew is a place where they need to get in economically and a place where they need refuge in case troops are going through the countryside, ransacking homes, which happens quite often in Alsace. And they can't afford the displeasure of the magistrates that come from these specific interactions, which, to be honest, looking through other court cases, there's nothing so special about these interactions except the fact that these Jews take burghers to Rottweil, which stopped happening pretty much, not 100%, after the formation of this contract. And so what Josel does in this contract, which I think is a very sort of active stance to take, is he addresses the specific concerns that the magistrates have. The first concern, of course, being taking Jews taking burghers to court at Rottweil, which is something that impinges on both the citizens themselves, who have these high legal fees to pay, and high legal fees in the realm of, when I've looked at some of these Rottweil cases, let's say it's a transaction of about 60 gulden. The legal fees can be as high as 44 gulden or 30 gulden. So it's, first of all, legal fees are half of the amount you're fighting over in the first place. And when you think about just the salary of a master artisan in these days, which is about 40 to 50 gulden, you're talking about really high sums of money. So on the one hand, this is an attempt of the magistrates to sort of help their citizens not have high costs that are unnecessary. But I think that's just a small piece of it. And I think, very much a part of what we've been talking about in terms of social order and control. The magistrates don't want to give up their privilege. They have this privilege over the courts. They want all court cases to be brought before them. They want the right to do that. They have their own jurisdiction, and they don't want court cases from their jurisdiction to go outside of their control, of their oversight. And actually, this comes out in some of the later documents which refer back to this contract, where Jews say, to the magistrates, writing to them saying, it's clear to us that you want us to bring this under your jurisdiction so that you can see what's going on. And I think that this issue of the magistrates having order over the city and sort of control over what kinds of economics go on and when things go badly, how they're resolved, this is something very important to the magistrates. So the first thing that's addressed here is that basically, and this is the next few paragraphs, which I don't think we need to read together, what you have here is a situation where the Jews agree not to go to Rottweil at all. And they basically say, we're going to go to the magistrates, themselves, and we will no longer take any burgher or burger's burger of the city of Strassburg to a foreign court, and only before our honorable men, the law and council of the aforementioned city of Strasbourg, or wherever they direct us. In other words, if they designate another court as being appropriate, that would be all right, are we permitted to appear. And so this is a very limited thing. Just as sort of a side note that I also wanted to open up and have people think about, this decision of taking these steps was made by the whole community. You see the sentence before. We gathered in Rosheim and decided that we, without exception of any of us, according to this letter, will no longer take any of these people to court. And I think this is also a very important part of the idea of this being a contract, which is not my imposition. If you've read through the document, you see that this is called a contract, and I'll get back to that in a moment. What's interesting is that the leaders of the Jewish community come together to address this problem, and they want to decide together how to deal with the city and how to best address the problems that they're having with the city. And this idea of the community coming together sort of further by the steps that they actually take to enforce this contract, which on the Jewish side is that Josel writes a letter, 1 week after this, to the Jewish community saying, anyone who breaks this contract is going to get excommunicated. You can't eat with him, you can't drink with him, you can't speak to him in the street. And when you're talking about a community that's comprised of such scattered settlements, it's a really big deal to not be able to talk to somebody or eat with somebody, because chances are in your travels for trade, this is exactly what you need to do. And this isn't just a sort of prescription of excommunication. There are a bunch of examples in the archives of Jews who were excommunicated for violating this contract, and of Jews who fear excommunication and write to the magistrates saying, we didn't mean to violate the contract, so therefore, we really hope that you'll understand we didn't realize that this guy was a burgher. Now that we know, we're bringing him before your court, and please accept our apologies because we don't want to get excommunicated. So there's a real power that the community has in enforcing this contract. The second thing that's in this contract, the second sort of part of it, which is that in previous years, there's an issue of Jews having goods that were stolen, brought to them for pawning and for loans and for collateral. And this was an issue throughout the empire, which was actually addressed at the Reichstag in Augsburg in 1530. This threat that what if something was stolen from a Christian and then brought to a Jew? Who was responsible? And at the Reichstag, the Jews maintained the right to not have to return the good itself. But here, this was a sticking point from the Christian perspective. The Jews agree that when something is stolen, the Jews will take an oath that they weren't involved. They will return the stolen good and not even get any sort of repayment for that. So the Jews are going as far as they can to address the concerns of the city, both in terms of giving up their imperial right at Rottweil and also in terms of giving up their right to sort of not have to reimburse the thief, as it were, for this good that came to them unbeknownst to them as a stolen good. And this is the kinds of steps that the Jews take in order to safeguard their relationship with the city. And I think that these are extremely active steps. And it's not just because, they need to do this, and so they opt to draft this contract. They enforce this contract on their end in terms of regulating Jewish behavior so that Jews cannot do this without excommunication. We see multiple examples of this even after Josel of Rosheim's lifetime. But also in another way that's extremely interesting, which is that when Strasbourg clamps down and promulgates a law that basically says no more Jews using our roads, no more Jews allowed in any of our areas or jurisdictions, Jewish communal leaders petition the city saying, we have this Jewish contract, and we are permitted to trade in your city under the following circumstances. And there's this sense of entitlement that comes along with this, or an expectation that, even though this is by no means a contract between two equal parties, that both the city and the Jews are responsible for maintaining this relationship, which I think is a key aspect to these rural Jews creating for themselves a space within the Christian city. And I think that's what we see here. I mean, this is a city, when we talked about urban spaces, I was thinking about this. We've got a city where I can't point to a region that Jews are permitted or where Jews are allowed, but the Jews are sort of creating for themselves a space in which they're permitted to operate, or rules under which they can, in some kind of order that the city will permit, so this sort of tacit contract, or this tacit understanding that's not on the law books, but that's found in the archives through these drafts. They're creating the space for themselves within the city and rules under which they can operate. And indeed, this is what you see happening. You see Jews bringing court cases to the magistrates, and not just court cases with Jews, with Christians, but with other Jews as well, just coming to see the Strasbourg magistrates. I want to point to one more thing, at least in the contract, and this is a sentence that really jumps out at me. I'll start at the beginning of the paragraph. Strong, noble, honorable, cautious, respectable, and wise, honorable sirs, I report subserviently, and your honor sent to me copies of a contract. I'm assuming that even though we don't have this, these are sort of drafts of what the city's wishes were. Although now your honors, without a doubt, are in such high honorable understanding that you do not desire, nor are you inclined against propriety, to deal with a Jew as with a Christian, through several misunderstandings, your honors did not have a thorough understanding, and therefore you commanded to me to settle these differences so that men in future years would not want to come to any misunderstandings. This is much easier to read in German because it flows nicer. English doesn't work so well here. But basically, the part that jumps out at me is that Josel of Rosheim, the leader of the Alsatian Jews at this point, is saying to the magistrates, you didn't understand exactly what happened here, and he actually makes excuses for Jacob of Niedershofen and of Blumel of Pfaffenhofen. But what he's saying, essentially, is you don't want to treat Jews like you do treat Christians. You're not inclined to do that, but still, you do want to not have misunderstandings with our community. And I think this is essential to understanding the relationship of the Jew to the city. It's a very strange formulation. It's almost bizarre to hear Jewish leaders saying, I know you don't want to treat us like you treat Christians, which would, be improper, but you still want to treat us with some kind of respect. This could be, Stefan and I were talking about this before, diplomacy on Josel's part. He was extremely pragmatic, I find, in all of his undertakings. But I think it's something that I would like to hear everybody's thoughts on. Similarly, in the third text, which is Josel's request for shelter in the city during the war, and here it's extremely confusing because it's dated 1534, but I think it should probably be dated 1524. The tone that Josel adopts is also one that's very solicitous of the magistrates, which is not so surprising as in the first text. But the last sentence of this request, it is not through our willfulness or in any ways we want to be injurious or powerful, but we want this, meaning shelter in the city from the troops, so much in our poor abilities, and here Josel's been highlighting how poor the Jews are and how much they suffer because of it, towards the commendable city, subserviently or irresponsible. In other words, he doesn't say explicitly, we are entitled to refuge, and indeed they're not. The Jews are not permitted residence in Strasbourg even for one night. But he comes to the magistrates and asks them to, through their mercy and charity, allow them in with this sort of subservient tone, understanding the second-class nature of the Jew. And this is what happens. The Jews are allowed into Strasbourg during this war, and again during the Schmalkaldic War. The next text is just a similar thing that happens in the city of Hagenau, so I don't think we need to go into that. But these are some of the things, sort of the agency of the Jews, the creation of Jewish space within an urban space that doesn't allow Jews in, both legally and technically in terms of residence and other rights, and this sort of hesitant status that the Jew takes for himself. So whatever anyone else sees in this would also be great to talk about.
Well, these were very interesting documents. I admit to a prejudice because I didn't become further history right now. I found it particularly interesting, and it was a wonderful elucidation. But I had an issue with the presentation, and then I said one thing, and I thought, smoking gun. And that is when you said that talking to me really was not as exactly what you were saying. Just that you're saying that this illustrates how the Jews made for themselves a space within the Christian city in the form of rules under which they could operate effectively and economically. I just want to kind of get clear on that. It seems to me that's exactly an instance of using the concept of space in that metaphorical sense of room to maneuver and so on. And maybe we should talk a little bit about, whether that is a valuable and useful way to understand space. And maybe just thinking about space in physical terms is too restrictive. And maybe it is as important a concept to talk about Jews having a relationship to the city where they don't have Jewish sites or places that Jews are formally affiliated with Jewish presence, that yet in a meaningful form of space. And I guess I can't resist asking in some way whether we have any sense of the city like Strasbourg, even if we're using space in this metaphorical sense, is there any part of the city where they would be more likely to go to do those things that they do? Is there in fact some physical space in the city that is associated with those activities through which they have metaphorically created a space for themselves to operate in the city?
I haven't found any specific space that's linked to Jews or any documents where, when documents talk about where Jews can go in the city, there doesn't seem to be any limit or any designation of an area to which Jews go. My instinct is to say, well, Jews probably primarily go to the marketplace because that's primarily what they're there for. But then we see Jews popping up in other odd corners of the city, so that in church records you have a Jew basically writing out an oath, just a typical Jewish oath that has nothing to do with the church records, and then somebody in another hand transcribing that from Judeo-German, not in Hebrew, but Judeo-German into German. So it seems that the Jews are getting into other spaces in terms of interacting with Christians, teaching them Hebrew. This is in the early 16th century. By 1570, it really disappears as the city gets more and more Orthodox. But I don't think that there's a specific place that's associated with Jews. And what I was struck by in your talk was the way in which you could highlight, Jewish space and what space meant to Jews and what space meant to Christians. And I was thinking how my research focuses on Jews without space, and specifically because I work on Strasbourg, they don't have a specific place. And I was wondering, what do they feel in this city? Do they identify with any specific physical landmarks? Do they have a reaction to the statues of synagogue and ecclesia on the cathedral, or do they not notice it? Do they walk past the old Jewish street on which some of their ancestors lived, and does that resonate with them in any way? And I don't know, because I almost feel like the Jews are rootless and travel through the city, and the only sort of limitation that I've found is that in the decrees of the Turnherren, who are the gatekeepers of the city, they're sort of told to escort the Jews and make sure they really only go where it is they say they're supposed to be going, and then they check their bags on the way out to make sure that they don't have any goods that burghers would be incriminated by. And so it suggests that there are actions and activities that are restricted, but I can't find any limit, such as Jews shouldn't go near the cathedral, or they shouldn't go near the gymnasium, or any places like that. And you have also sermons preached from the cathedral aimed at converting the Jew, which would suggest that the Jews are in close enough proximity to hear these sermons, and they're not purely rhetorical. So I don't know. I mean, there's two kinds of space, and I can't put my finger on a physical space for the Jew in Strasbourg, except that I know that he and she, because the women are doing this also, it's very clear the women are heavily involved in the trade, are going into the city.
It's really nice understanding those sources that actually we have an active Jewish part negotiating with British authorities about space to move in an actually forbidden town city. So that's actually thinking that Strasbourg was probably not an exception at all. So because we had like numerous huge and smaller cities in Germany that we have exactly the same situation. Jews are settling around the city, they're forbidden to live inside, but they are really allowed to go inside for 1 day, just probably 2 days, it depends on the city, right? So that makes me think that firstly we have also like negotiations between both sides, but unfortunately those documents are either not preserved or they have never been written, I don't know. But for sure the very famous personality was involved in this. So
I haven't seen it in any of the work on Augsburg or in your work on Thuringia. I haven't seen any mention of a contract, and I'm not sure if it's the sort of forceful personality of a Josel, or if it's sort of the reputation of Strasbourg as more tolerant, or what exactly it is, because there's so few Jews living in Alsace, and there's so many Jews living in Fürth outside Nuremberg and in Markgrafschaft Burgau outside Augsburg, that it's almost bizarre that this is the place where you have a negotiated contract that's also implemented, and that the Jews expect the city to implement it. And I don't know if it just doesn't exist or if it hasn't been preserved or if people haven't found it, but it's striking because of that. It makes it somewhat unique.
I would think about another kind of space, the one in the document seems to be featured, which is the judicial space. Anyway, is very good. And one of the things that I'm beginning to try to investigate is the question of the regularization of the Jewish legal status. Regularization not in the sense that there is some status for the Jews, but rather the Jewish legal status becomes regular, like everyone else's. And I think this is a long, slow lead-up prelude to the Enlightenment where Jews get considered others. Now this is just a glimmer. It's very important because they're saying, well, the conditions of being here under what to do, whatever, however long, depends on our accepting a kind of social contract, a gender social contract, in the sense that everybody agrees that there's a sovereign and we all live under the same body of laws. And roughly speaking, we have a tiny little step to that. But that's where we're going here. This is just after, 30, 40 years after the reception of the Jus Commune into Germany. So I see it as that. How are the Jews going to begin to create a place for themselves, a space, a real space, which is the real space, is to somehow or other accept the fact that the community has jurisdiction, not to take people here and elsewhere. That's one of the reasons they got thrown out of England in the 13th century. They were supposed to deal with somebody with a loan in one place, and the king said, no, take it to the king's court at the other end of town, and we'll deal with it there. And people were fed up with this. So this is extremely interesting.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective, which I didn't see, because, the Jews are basically now down to the same exact standards as the citizens of Strasbourg are down to. You do have the occasional sort of going to the imperial court, but he's not supposed to be doing that either. And magistrates get really upset about that also. They really prefer that they're controlling all of for cases involving anybody belonging to them. So I didn't see that they are going to have their special rights that they earned 4 years earlier at Reichstag.
The issue of primary jurisdiction is absolutely vitally critical to running of any government. If I get a traffic ticket, I have to go to one court. If I beat you up, I have to go to another court. And I don't have to learn to choose. And that's how the state exercises power.
I actually, I have a question that perhaps reflects my lack of knowledge about the area, but it comes because of great knowledge about the other side of the Holy Roman Empire. We mustn't forget that the Holy Roman Empire is controlled by Habsburgs, and in other Habsburg domains, there's a very important, the same situation applies, right? Jews are allowed in cities, and workers don't like the Jews, and they negotiate all sorts of relationships. But I know in small villages all around and so on. But they are often under protection and have special rights because they're under the protection that tends to Poland as well of the nobility, right? And so, is there any role of the nobility, or do we just have the city and the emperor somewhere off?
It's so much
but anyway, because Jews get into all sorts of places because of their connections to the nobility.
One of the things that's so interesting about this, which I didn't bring into this specific contract because I wanted to focus on the relationship with the city, Jews have relationships with many overlapping jurisdictions, and sometimes they are smart enough to sort of use the jurisdictions against each other. So, for example, if you have the city of Rosheim, you have one person writes to the city of Rosheim and says, why are you expelling my father? And the city explains back, the magistrates write back saying, well, he's over the quota. So he writes to the noble that he lives in under his jurisdiction, says, well, can you intercede in any way here? And in this case, the noble says, no, I can't, because the city really has its own rights as a free imperial city. When Strassburg sort of clamps down in 1570 and the Jews try to enforce the contract, they also get the Emperor Maximilian to write a letter on their behalf saying, these are my Jews. It doesn't always work that way. I think for the big events that might happen, and certainly the Jews are trying to manipulate those relationships to some extent, but there is this contract with the city, and I think the city's so important to them economically and also just in terms of the physical safety, which is not as constant, obviously, not a daily concern, that they have to maintain that positive relationship no matter what, and so they have to stick by these rules to some extent. I haven't found any case where the Jews are going, except to the emperor, in the case I just mentioned in 1570, the Jews don't usually go to territorial princes to go over the city of Strasburg's jurisdiction. It's usually other smaller areas and not Strasbourg. So,
thank you very much.